Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're stepping into some of the most intense, highly political, and honestly, deeply philosophical territory we've ever covered. We're going to analyze the absolute limits of executive command when a leader is placed under just crushing existential pressure. What actually happens when the survival of a state rests entirely on the shoulders of a single person, and that state is mathematically doomed to fall?
Okay, let's look at our roadmap for today. We'll start with two leaders, doomed nations, then move into war as nation building, examine leading through progressive defeat, cross over into the moral threshold, and finally look at their unresolved echoes. It's a dense journey, so let's jump right in.
Section 1. Two leaders, doomed nations. Before we get into the heavy analysis, we really need to set the stage.
So, to establish our baseline, we're looking at two highly specific historical figures. On one hand, you've got Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America from 1861 to 1865. And on the other, there's Francisco Solano López, who led Paraguay during the truly catastrophic War of the Triple Alliance from 1864 to 1870. Now, obviously, their geographies, their cultures, their political systems, they were vastly different. Davis led a rebellion in North America, while López led a sovereign South American nation against this massive coalition of its own neighbors. But here's the connection. Both men faced immense, state-shattering wars that ultimately ended in total, devastating defeat.
Now, before we go a single step further, we have to establish a mandatory moral baseline. The Confederacy explicitly defended slavery as an institution. This is a non-negotiable historical fact. Jefferson Davis's leadership, his political motivations, and the very existence of the state he led literally cannot be separated from the violent defense of human slavery. We are not here to soften this. There are no apologies to be made here. This indisputable fact absolutely has to anchor our entire view of his actions throughout this analysis.
And that brings us to our other subject, and the fierce contradiction surrounding him. Was Francisco Solano López a heroic defender of a besieged nation fighting for its very right to exist, or was he a tyrant who just obstinately drove his own people into a meat grinder? This is a perpetual, highly charged, and entirely unresolved debate within Paraguay to this very day. And I want to state very clearly right now, we are deliberately not going to try to resolve that tension today. Our goal is strictly to examine how he operated within that fierce contradiction.
All right, moving to Section 2, War as Nation Building. Let's look at how these leaders actually operated under fire. Think about how leaders attempt to forge a cohesive national identity when their nation is, quite literally, being attacked from all sides. Jefferson Davis was tasked with building a Confederate national identity completely from scratch. He's inventing a nation while the Union Army is actively dismantling the very territory he claims to rule. It's the ultimate paradox, right? It's literally like trying to build a house while the ground is swallowing it whole. Meanwhile, Francisco Solano López demanded absolute, unbreakable cohesion from the Paraguayan people against an overwhelming coalition of Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. And he pushed this demand until Paraguay faced near demographic extermination, losing a horrifying percentage of its entire adult male population.
What's really wild here is how these existential pressures just completely rewrite the rules. Forging an identity amidst collapsing borders, commanding total state mobilization, facing escalating demographic extermination. Look, under this level of fire, nation building isn't a political project anymore. It's not a cultural project. It transforms strictly into a brutal survival mechanism. The state becomes the war, and the war becomes the state.
Which brings us to our third section, leading through progressive defeat. This is where things get incredibly grim.
We're moving from the concept of identity construction directly into the crushing reality of military decline. If you trace the trajectory of a doomed war, in the first year, there's high morale. There's a genuine belief in victory. But then, usually around year 3, you hit this critical, terrifying juncture where inevitable defeat becomes mathematically certain. The resources are just gone. Yet, time and time again, we see a staunch refusal to capitulate. Both Davis and López kept fighting long past that point, leading directly to the absolute collapse of their states. The crucial focus here is that gap, that horrifying space between the moment loss becomes an absolute certainty and the moment it actually finally arrives.
So, ask yourself this. When a leader is operating in that doomed gap, is pressing on a legitimate, principled conviction, or is it just an inability to separate one's own ego from the tragic fate of those forced to follow them? Were Davis and López acting out of a profound, albeit tragic sense of duty, or could they simply not let go of a doomed cause?
This perfectly sets up Section 4, the moral threshold. This is really the climax of our analysis today.
We are shifting gears from military strategy and the psychology of command directly into the realm of intense moral philosophy. Think of the moral threshold as a line in the sand. It is the exact point where resistance ceases to be heroism and instead becomes a direct responsibility for the suffering of one's own people. When you know, mathematically, that the war is completely lost, at what exact moment does resolute, unyielding leadership cross the line into becoming responsible for the pointless agony, starvation, and death of the very citizens you're supposed to protect?
To really understand this threshold, you have to compare their ultimate fates. Jefferson Davis fled his collapsing capital, was captured by Union forces, and he survived. He lived for decades after the war. Francisco Solano López, on the other hand, absolutely refused to yield. He retreated deep into the wilderness until he was finally killed in combat, reportedly shouting that he died with his country. So the question is, did either of these men actually cross that moral threshold, or did they both perish, one figuratively as a captured leader, the other literally on the muddy banks of a river just moments before crossing it?
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, Unresolved Historical Contradictions.
As we bring today's explainer to a close, I want to be absolutely 100% clear about something. We are explicitly rejecting the urge to tie these complex, bloody histories up with a neat, diplomatic bow. We have to embrace ambiguity. And by ambiguity, I mean the necessary historical state of accepting unresolved contradictions without seeking a comfortable, reductive balance. Look, human nature wants to find a middle ground. I vigorously challenge that instinct. There is no soft moral equivalence here. You cannot balance the historical record of the Confederacy's defense of slavery with romanticized notions of a lost cause. It was a slave state, full stop. And on the flip side, you cannot cleanly categorize Lopez as purely a national hero or purely a villainous butcher without completely erasing half of Paraguay's historical reality. Ambiguity is literally the only intellectually honest way to assess these legacies.
So I'm going to leave you with this final thought to chew on. Did their final, desperate resistance forge an eternal national spirit, or did it merely guarantee the absolute devastation of the people they claimed to lead? We aren't going to declare a winner or a loser here today, because history rarely ever offers us that luxury. Instead, I challenge you to just sit with the immense discomfort of these contradictions. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always question the limits of the narratives you thought you knew. Catch you next time.